Hello and welcome to week 2, Sociology. Today we're going to look at the theory. So theories are foundations of beliefs about the world around us, and in particular we're focusing on Canada. And the theorist, if you will, we're going to see probably 6 or 7 different theorists. I'd like you to consider them kind of like wearing sunglasses of different colors that look at the world. So I put on a pair of black sunglasses, I see the world around me, and then I put some blue ones on and I see the world around me. All the things that I see are similar, but there's a slight variation of how they see the world. And so theorists, they all have a particular way that they view the world based on their own research that's been done and the data that's been collected. And so they have different ways of explaining how the world is or how society is, and the influences in society, and how society affects individuals, and how individuals affect society, how we come to know the things we do. So no one theory is correct. So please, let's go through these, see them as different things. You might even be able to identify yourself with a theory that you sort of go, well, that sort of sounds a bit like the way I see the world. It doesn't make it right. It just makes it an understanding about how you see the world. Somebody else might see the world a little differently. And what I challenge you to do is to get your head around, use your sociological imagination to sort of view the world through the eyes of these different theorists, to sort of see how the world could be understood that way. And so we'll go through this in this week's video.
Okay, now we're going to look at some contemporary theoretical perspectives. Now when I say contemporary, we're looking at things going back a little ways, but they're still current. They continue to do some research and something a little bit more current in terms of its development later in our society. Now I've got a picture in the middle there of different color sunglasses, and it's one way to sort of view theories, and that is to say you look through these different color glasses, and as much as the world out there doesn't change just because you're wearing a different color set of glasses, it just changes the color, but it gives you a slightly different perspective. And each of these theories are kind of like a different pair of sunglasses. You look at society with one set of pair of glasses, it could be a functionalist view. And yet if you put on another pair of glasses, you might be looking at it from a feminist point of view. Or you might be looking at it from a postmodern point of view. So I just really wanted to make sure that we're going to review these ones and you get a little view of what they're all about. Okay? Now, before we get started really in terms of what are these theories, a little background and a very brief background in terms of research. Now, there's two types of research that's being done in any science, whether it's psychology, science as a science, or sociology or anthropology, and that is you're either going to be doing quantitative or qualitative research. Now, if you're doing quantitative research, you're studying data. Data is numbers that can be measured. If you cannot measure it, count it, or see it, you're not doing quantitative research. And so data could be how many people of a certain age, race, sex, education, or income, and that's all basically quantitative research. And what you're trying to do is control for bias. If you're counting numbers of men age 30 to 35, there's no bias. There's no, I think this person is. You either are or you're not. There's no bias. And so this is one way of controlling bias very well. But you have to operationally define. You have to be very clear about what it is you're counting. Now, qualitative, this is a little different. This sort of takes the other side of data. This is a more interpretive description, using people's words, discovering the underlying meaning or patterns of social relationships. And in order to do that, you have to ask people. So you're doing interviews, you're making observations, you're giving surveys, you're handing out questionnaires. You're getting people's feedback, you're getting their words. Now, of course, with words, it's easier to interpret. It's easier to make errors. It's easier to be influenced by bias. However, in quality research, they put as many as they can imagine checks and balances in to ensure that it's not the researcher's bias that influences things, that it's the words of different human beings and their perspectives. So those two styles of research follow a similar research model or process. And this process can be described in 6 steps. The first step is to select and define a research problem. Now, maybe I grew up in a family of a single mom who struggled with making ends meet. And so it might be, from my experience, that becomes my research problem. How can we better provide support to single moms to nurture and care for kids that they are raising, where income or access to good paying jobs or access to employment or education can be a challenge? And so you select and you define your research. You try to be very clear about what it is and what it's not. Secondly, you go back and look at other research that's been done and see what they found. And if there's research that answers your question, then you don't need to repeat it. Or you can repeat it to verify the results of that previous research. But if you find that what you're doing hasn't been done before, you may again stick with that, define it, and begin your research. Then you formulate a hypothesis. And another word for hypothesis is educated guess. If I think that there's a solution to my research problem, I could formulate my hypothesis based on what I think is the solution. And so in this, you're looking at what are called dependent and independent variables. And the operational definition really just means you're making it very clear, you're making it very specific, and you're not leaving it open to interpretation. Once you've formulated your hypothesis, you design your research. Now this is where you're designing a test, you're designing a methodology of how you're going to gather data. And once you've refined that research to where you feel you're going to gather the data that you need to answer your hypothesis, you go about doing the research and collecting and analyzing your data. Now you're still aiming to collect the data at arm's length without interfering with your bias. You really just want the data to speak for itself. See what the data tells you about what you researched and how does it reflect on your hypothesis. So the last step is that you draw conclusions. And based on those conclusions, you either have supported your hypothesis or you didn't. Either way, it's successful. There's no failure in not proving your hypothesis. Once you've drawn your conclusions, it's important to report your findings. You publish them. That way others can read them, can offer you feedback, critique, or can then go on and replicate your research to see if they get similar results. Now, by doing that, by replicating your research, they begin to solve a couple of problems, and that's called validity and reliability.
Okay, now since we're doing qualitative and quantitative research, there's a couple of issues that come up pretty standardly in research. And one of them is validity, and the other is reliability. For validity, it's the extent in which a study or the research accurately measures what it's supposed to measure. That is to say, if you're doing research on intelligence, your test or your research should be able to measure intelligence. And that would make it valid. If your research on intelligence measures strength, then it's not a very valid test. The other is reliability. And with reliability, it's the extent in which a study or a research instrument yields consistent results. So if I did my intelligence test on a group of students and I get a certain sort of range of results, then if I go to a completely different group of students and another researcher in fact gives the test, we should get a very similar range of results. That would make the test reliable. So these two things are competing but important variables into the research that's being done in sociology, psychology, biology, anthropology. Any of these sciences all are challenged with ensuring that their work is valid and reliable.
All right, let's begin with our first theorist. Now this is one of the older ones. Emil Durkheim had a big influence in this particular theory of functionalism. And part of what the main thrust here, I'm going to key on a few points, is they view society as a stable, orderly system. Now, the emphasis is on system and, of course, on orderly. That is to say that things don't change fast. They change slowly, methodically, and over time. Now, some of the basis of society, societal consensus of shared values, beliefs, and behavioral expectations. The rules of conduct, the way we interact with one another. We have rules of the road, how you drive down the road. We have laws that help keep behavioral expectations in order. We don't drive at any speed we want or on any side of the road we want. And so this shared values, beliefs, and behavioral expectations is a social consensus. We all agree. And that helps society behave in an orderly, stable way. Now, society has parts, many parts, and these parts put together make the whole system, and each of these parts have a specific function. It's like a living organism. So when we consider some of these structures, we would consider family as a structure, politics, the economy, healthcare, education, religion. These all have function or all have purpose. And these parts work collaboratively, they work together. You can't change one. Family size decreases from 6 people in a family to 4 people in a family. That affects the economy. It'll affect the education schools. It will affect healthcare. It will affect politicians and politics and policies that get made. So these work together for the benefit of all society. And so that was the main thrust of the original work that was being done in functionalism. Now, Durkheim wasn't the only theorist in functionalism. Talcott Parsons was also very involved, and he saw that all societies make provisions for meeting social needs in order to survive. And one of those things that needed to happen was what he described as division of labor. And this was necessary for survival. And he divided this division of labor into 2 roles, instrumental roles and expressive roles. Instrumental roles, leadership was important to the instrumental role, decision making, provider, often was the husband or father. And then the expressive role, basically housework, caring for children, providing the emotional support for the family. This was often the wife. Were important to success of the family, were important to success and stability of a society. Now, you're probably imagining this is a fairly traditional, older view of family, and it is. But we still have there's still a very big part of society that would like to see this return or still become the hallmark of what a family and what society should be. So it hasn't entirely disappeared. And there's been other influences in functionalism. R.K. Merton, we'll move to the next one here. R.K. Merton is also a functionalist, and his work was to involve 3 major pieces. One was he saw that these parts of society, these structures, had manifest and latent functions. That is to say that if you had a manifest function, it was the intended function of that structure, and it was recognized by the participants in a social setting. So for example, in education, which is a structure, its function as a manifest function was to teach skills and broaden awareness of students. Now that was intended, that's what education is intended to do. It's overt, we say it out loud, this is what education is supposed to do. But then there's also latent functions, and education has latent functions as well. Latent functions are the unintended or the hidden functions that aren't really acknowledged by participants, sometimes aren't the intended objectives. So in education, you'd have the social network. Some of the friends that you've had through different stages of school are friends that you have for life. You may even have found your one love and your marriage partner out of your experience of being in school. Now that's not what education is about, but it might be something that was the latent function of education. Social institutions like family, the economy, politics, these structures provide a function to society, and often they'll have manifest and latent functions. And let's move on to another theorist, and we'll look at conflict. Now, conflict theorists were predominantly, the influencers of this were Karl Marx and Max Weber. The main elements of conflict theory, now this is an older theory and it doesn't apply to all elements of society, but it is an element that is viewed functional in much of society. Groups in society are engaged in a continuous power struggle for control of scarce resources. The bourgeoisie, now I've put a symbol of being people with money, they control the means of production. So whatever we can produce and are creating in a society through industry, through manufacturing, and the people who own that, they are the people who control those means of production. And means of production can be tools, it can be land, it can be factories, money for investment that form the economic basis of society. The proletariat, or the workers, they sell their labor. So if I'm hired by somebody, as I am hired by the college, I sell my time and my labor to the college to provide your education. From a conflict perspective, the CEO, the board of governors are people who would be considered the bourgeois. They control the means of production. If they make a change in how we deliver, your online education, for example, more online education is being offered because there's a government mandate to be increasing online education to 30%. And so those of us that sell our labor are producing that. We're doing that. We don't control that. I don't decide for myself. I think I'm going to teach online. We have to put things online, and so certainly I volunteered to do something of that sort, but at some point others are being asked to do it because it's a mandate. It's a decision that the bourgeois of a college will decide to do. Now, one of the other elements within conflict is what's called alienation. And that's another term that conflict theorists introduce. It's the powerlessness or the disconnectedness that workers have, a feeling of powerlessness and estrangement from other people and from oneself. Exploitation leads to alienation is a perspective of conflict theory. So I put it on on an angle to sort of say that some people have more power and influence than others. Now, conflict theorists also introduced a couple of other components. And one is called prestige, and the other is the power elite. Prestige is the positive or negative social estimation of honor. So there's things in our society that we hold in high prestige. And there are things in our society we have in low or negative prestige. And it's a social estimation of honor. And there's, we often have said, lawyers, doctors, these are people that we put in high prestige, and other professions or occupations we may put in lower prestige. The power elite would be a small clique comprising of top corporate, political, or military officials, and they may hold an awful lot of influence and power in part because of resources, money, influence, control. All can have a big part of what the power elite is. Now, built off of conflict, it was emerged out of the second wave of the feminist movement, or emerged out of the 60s. And this looks a little differently in terms of the same imbalances, but it's not based on bourgeois or the workers. It's based on men and women. That gender is a necessary category to understand and explain the inequities in terms of inequities in homes, paid labor, politics, law, culture. And that's the feminist perspective, that the inequities that exist between men and women are deep and built into society. Now, there is different forms of feminism: radical, socialist, liberal, and there's many more than that. But when they look at this inequity that they see in homes, paid labor, politics, law, and culture, They see this, that men tend to have more power and control than women and receive more benefits in the home. Women do what's called, from a sociological perspective, the second shift. They may be employed and working, come home, and then they care for the children, they make the meals, they do the laundry. And that's what's called the second shift. Why is that the case from a feminist perspective? In paid labor, men are paid more for equal work. Women have been discouraged from working non-traditional roles like military, construction, science, and technology. Now, we do see some of the efforts of feminist movement making a shift in that, but nonetheless, there's still inequity that exists from a feminist perspective. Politically, they're not properly represented in politics, given their numbers in politics. There's not as many. Law, feminists made initial headway when women were in the right to be seen as persons in 1929. And since then, they've been fighting continually for additional rights of equality, including rights in the equality of pay. Culturally, well, when you think about it, and this has been changing too, fortunately, but for example, hockey in Canada is largely a male-dominated sport, but we see more examples where women are getting involved in hockey, and they're being viewed from a Canadian perspective as highly valued. They don't get paid the same, but there's improvements being made nonetheless. And so when we look at, from a feminist perspective, they would view that the world is predominantly in what's called a patriarchal society. Men have more power and influence than women do, and it's called patriarchy. Now, I put Papa in there to help you remember that the P in patriarchy is Papa, male-driven or male-led, male-advantaged. Then there is matriarchy. Now, we don't see too many societies, in fact, very few societies that are matriarchal. Elephants are matriarchal. They're led by the eldest female. And so matriarcha and mama. But what feminists are driving for is more egalitarian or equal, a balance between men and women. We see more and more families moving to what we would call an egalitarian family. The feminists would like to see more of an egalitarian society. Now, this particular this theory is called Symbolic Interactionist. Now, the other four so far have been what we would call macro theories. Macro theories are theories that look at the big picture, look at all of society. Now, symbolic interactionists are what we would call micro. They look at the relationships between people and individuals, and maybe even between groups. So society is the sum of all the interactions of individuals and groups. So even though as a family, we're all different in terms of our family, symbolic interactionalists want to know how we are similar in terms of how we teach our children, how we experience celebrations, why do we have the celebrations we have. They concentrate on these interactions between individuals rather than the larger social system. They're interested in the meanings that people associate with events and symbols, and so they look at the smaller scale interactions between people. And lastly, we'll look at what's known as postmodernist perspective. And the postmodernist perspective makes an assumption, and the assumption is this: existing theories of society have been unsuccessful in explaining social life that is a result of postmodern industrialization, consumerism, global communication, and they feel that they've failed in that area. So they've really emerged in this more modern day world of multimedia, social media, where they look at some of the characteristics of a postmodern society to include this information explosion. There's almost nothing you can't find, and there's nothing that is deleted. You are always out there. The internet is broad and vast. The rise of a consumer society, I mean, the amount of commercialization that's occurred is astronomical. The amount of money that can be generated and made, and the amount of advertising that is reaching out to people at so many different levels. The global village image. You can be communicating with anybody in the world virtually. Space and time distance doesn't mean the same as it did 20 years ago. And then the post-industrial society, just that we've gone through all this growth and development, we've done so in a very rapid pace. You know, the pace between being hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists was thousands of years. To get into manufacturing was thousands of more. But to go in the information technology has been 30 years. And so it's been so fast, the postmodernist perspective is to look at what's the implications of all this rapid growth in information technology and the like, and what does that do to society and individuals and groups. All right, I hope this has been helpful. This is, I think, what you should be able to expect from the videos that will come out. Will be of this sort of length and of this sort of quality, and I'll put some green screen in as well as some voiceover. All right, I hope you've enjoyed, and take care and good luck.